Welcome, everyone. Good evening. If it is not evening where you are, then good whatever time of day. Thank you for joining us for this Conversation with Friends event. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Anna Wyeth. I'm the Director of Alumni Programs. I'm so thrilled to be here tonight with our wonderful guests. Before we get started, I just have a couple of very quick housekeeping items. I really want to encourage everyone to keep your video on during this Zoom if you feel comfortable doing so. It really does help us feel that full participation of everyone who's in the room, everyone who's joined us. I also want to encourage you to change your Zoom name to include your full name and reflect your connection to Sidwell Friends, whether that's your class year, if you're a current or former faculty member, if you're a parent of an alum or a grandparent. Whatever it is, you can think of your Zoom name as your virtual name tag, and it lets us see who all is here. And if you've never changed your name on Zoom before, you can hover over your own name in the participant list, and you'll see a little more button. If you click on that, you'll see the option to rename, and then you can type in your name there. We'll ask that everyone just keep yourselves on mute to minimize disruptions during our conversation. We'll save asking questions for the dedicated Q&A portion a little bit later in the event. If you do have a question throughout this evening, please feel free to send it to us in the chat. You can send it to Sidwell Friends School. My colleague Zuher is managing that and can take questions. You can send them to me as well in the chat, and we will either ask your question on your behalf during the Q&A, or if you'd like to ask it yourself, just let us know that in the chat and we'll let you know when it's your turn to ask your question. Now, finally, to get to the thing that we are all here for tonight, I'm so excited to introduce our featured speakers. Dax Devlin Ross is the class of 1993 and is the author of 5 books. He's a journalist who's been featured in Time, The Guardian, New York Times, Virginia Quarterly Review, The Washington Post Magazine, and many more. And his book, Letters to My White Male Friends, is what we're discussing this evening. He won the National Association of Black Journalists Investigative Reporting Award for his coverage of jury exclusion in North Carolina courts. And he's currently a reporting fellow at Type Media Center. A New York City teaching fellow turned nonprofit executive, Dax is now a principal at the social impact consultancies Dax-Dev and Third Settlements, both of which focus on designing disruptive strategies to generate equity in workplaces and education spaces alike. He got his JD from George Washington University and currently resides here in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Alana, and their young daughter, Ella. Our co-hosts tonight who are speaking with Dax, I'm going to start with Gareth Schweitzer, who's class of 1995. Gareth serves as the president of Material Company Action Division, leading teams across strategic planning, branding, marketing, and product design to drive growth, encourage collaboration, and ensure the combined team's success. He's also the co-founder and CEO of Kelton, a material company. And before Kelton, he was a political journalist and an embedded reporter in Iraq during the war's early days. He's appeared on CNN, Fox News, and nationally syndicated radio, to discuss topics ranging from global geopolitical affairs to consumer behavior. And he was born in India, grew up in London and DC, has lived in Chile, all over the world. We are very excited to have him here tonight. Our second co-host is Sophia Houdaigui, class of 2017. She is a recent graduate of Barnard College at Columbia University, where she studied history with a concentration in Middle Eastern and American history. Interested in the intersection of law, politics, media, and the arts, she will be attending the University of Chicago Law School this fall and is the co-founder of Hyphenated America, which is a civic education platform committed to making immigration laws and policies easier to understand. Their organization offers a number of resources, including accessible guides, a weekly newsletter, and a podcast where she has interviewed leading public servants, attorneys, and journalists. And now, truly without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dax, Gareth, and Sophia to get us started. Take it away, guys.
Wonderful. Just want to say thank you so much for that really warm introduction. I want to thank all of the people who've shown up tonight to spend a little time with us. I'm going to do just a quick intro of how we decided to orient this conversation, because this is a conversation with friends, but typically they're done in one-on-one fashion. But in conversations with staff and Gareth, it just became really evident that we had an opportunity to think about how do we be intersectional in our approach to this conversation and really invite in different generational voices. I think at this, at the crux of a lot of the conversations around equity that are taking place in this country, there are some generational components that need to be interspliced in that as well. So the connective thread and the connective tissue of this conversation, of course, is our civil experience. Happen at different points in time, vastly different points in time, but there's some obvious points of overlap, and we want to hopefully find those points of overlap in this space. So really briefly, as Anna pointed out, the book, here it is. It actually lands in stores tomorrow. I'm super proud of this little 200-page, very lean and efficiently written. I like to believe I was very intentionally to write something that was lean, that people could get into, they could find their way into, and that they would, wouldn't have to get lost in it to find a point of connection. But so what is this book, Letters to My White Male Friends? Just structurally, it is part memoir and part call to action. I really wanted to write a book that explored some of my personal experiences, both starting in DC, growing up in Shepherd Park, which some folks might know was a very integrated, unique neighborhood in Washington, DC, particularly in the post-civil rights era, into my time at Sidwell, and then through my formal education, which concluded in law school, with the purpose of really trying to shift the lens, to shift the gaze. I had a lot of experiences as a young man, young Black man, navigating a variety of institutional spaces where I was a minority, an extreme minority, or just in a place where I didn't look around and always see myself reflected back. And so you had to learn and develop certain skills to navigate that. And what I wanted to do was write something through the memoir side of the book that would help people re-examine their own life journey and to think about points in history, social history, that they lived through alongside me, because this is a very generational story, and ask them really pointed questions about how those moments in our shared history, how they landed on people, particularly my white friends. I write about things like being in high school when Clarence Thomas was nominated for the Supreme Court. I write about being in college when Charles Murray published The Bell Curve. I write about these kinds of moments because they had a deep impact on me. And I wondered and am curious about how my friends, how they thought about these instances of our shared political and social political life, and how they shaped and maybe formed their own experience and understanding of race and racism. The book is broken down into 3 different parts. So part 1 is framed around this idea of harm. Part 2 is around this idea of healing, which kind of explores my own journey of healing through a lot of the investigative reporting I did and through the work I did in the nonprofit space. And then part 3 is, what I think a lot of people want, which is the action, which is the practical tools that are really an extension of some of the work I get to do in the diversity, equity, and inclusion place in space. So that's sort of the sort of preamble, that if you're interested in this book, that's what it is. But ultimately, it was inspired by a letter. It was a letter that I wrote, not, in the days after George Floyd's murder. And I sent it to a handful of friends, and that letter found its way into the inbox of a lot more people and a lot more people and a lot more people. And I was shocked, stunned. I didn't know what, I feel like I'm a pretty good writer, but I didn't think it was the writing solely. It was something else that people were responding to. I know that I intended to write a story or write an experience to share with my white male friends of a certain age. That's what the story was called, the essay was called, that would help them maybe connect to their own emotions with respect to that moment, because I felt as though a lot of the calls that I was receiving from my friends was checking up on me, which I appreciate, but I wanted my friends to do some checking up on themselves, because race and racism isn't just happening to me and people who look like me. It's happening to all of us in this society, whether it makes us, indifferent towards certain things that take place. Maybe it makes us sort of come to certain conclusions about why the reality that we live in is the way that it is. In some way, shape, or form, we're living through that. And I would invite people, and wanted to invite people to process it, to reflect on it. And I hope that it was an invitation, and it seemed to be such. One of the people that reached out to me was Gareth. Hadn't heard from Gareth since we were in high school, but there was just this email in my inbox, and we got on the phone and talked. And so that was really, really a wonderful reintroduction to a wonderful and a great man. Like, I'm just really privileged to know this guy. He's he's become a friend of mine in this past year, and I can really genuinely say that. So I'm going to turn it over to Gareth to kind of move us forward in this conversation.
Well, thanks, Dax. And it's been awesome to reconnect with you. And one thing I'll say about this book is, as a guy with 3 kids under the age of 10, I read this book in a weekend, which hasn't happened to me in 10 years. So that'll give you some indication of how good and as Dax said, efficient a read this is. And it was great to reconnect with Dax personally. I literally am the white guy of a certain age. So when Dax's article landed in my inbox, it was hard not to be moved by it because it was written to me without being written to me. And it wasn't polemical and it wasn't accusatory in any way. It was just a request to be introspective enough to ask yourself whether or not you are doing enough or could do more. And I think the book is the same. It's not accusatory. It's not polemical. It's not trying to lay out an ideology. It's simply asking you to be introspective and ask questions of yourself about what role you want to play in having a more equitable and just world that we live in. And this has been a good year for me in that respect, reconnecting with Dax and trying to engage with a number of other people, I think, taking what Dax has put down on paper and practically applying that in the worlds that we live in, professionally, with our kids, with our familial relationships and our friends, and continually asking yourself those questions, not once, but on an ongoing basis, so that it actually becomes a part of who you are as a person. And that's really at the core of Dax's book. And apart from anything else, I just encourage you to read it, because for those of you that were a part of the Sidwell community, still are a part of the Sidwell community, it'll pull you back into a time and a place that'll bring some visceral emotions about for you as well as they did for me, because Sidwell meant so much to so many of us. So I just want to start there. I know we have a lot to cover. And say thank you to Dax for pulling this book together, number one, so quickly, but so beautifully, and really encourage everybody here to pick it up and have a read. And we're really fortunate as well to have Sophia here. Dax and I are of the same generation, and it's amazing to get to an age where you're on a call with somebody who you're saying is a different generation than you, but that's where I'm at in my life, and you are too, Dax. So I just want to invite Sophia also into that conversation to give her perspective, because I think she's lived this differently than either Dax or I did at our time at Sidwell.
Yeah, well, I am not a white man of a certain age. I thank you guys so much for having me in this conversation. I'm really honored to be involved. So I graduated from Sidwell in 2017. I entered the environment in the 3rd grade. My father immigrated from Morocco during the 80s, so being in an elite space that my father was, hearing about in journals and articles online was something that meant a lot to him. So, throughout my experience, I think that's something that'll come up a lot. But as I graduated from Sidwell in 2017, I just graduated from college about a month ago. So I'm really, thanks, we made it. So I really grew up not just at Sidwell, but also during my time in college at 2 particular moments of political and social and particularly racial unrest that I think have really, upon reflection on my time at Sidwell, which again, reading Dax's book, which again, we'll hear us say this a lot during this conversation, I think Gareth and I both share this, that it truly is an incredible read, and it will provoke you to be introspective about your experience, whether you were directly involved at Sidwell as a student, as a parent, whatever it may be. It will really give you an insight, not only to Dax's experience, but also allow you to reflect on moments that maybe didn't strike you in the same way when you were a 5th grader or a sophomore in high school, but upon reflection were really, motivating moments in your life. So with that, I think we're going to kind of go into the conversation here. So one of the first questions that in reflection on our time and experience that we've shared together was talking a lot about how, racism are manifested not only, in the experience just growing up in DC and in, the greater DMV area, but also particularly at Sidwell. So I'd love us to start by thinking about how did race and racism manifest in your Sidwell experience? What do you recall? What stands out? And how do you think these experiences shaped you? And I'd love to start with Dax on that question.
Yeah. I thought about that from almost two lenses. I had a buddy of mine who was also a Sidwell alum over last night, really briefly, and we actually started to take that question and pivot it a little bit to think about like this experience of privilege, and how that intersects with race in the Sidwell experience. And I write about in the book when I arrive in middle school. So there's, obviously people have different points of entry. For me, it was 7th grade. I had gone to Hearst Elementary School, which was right across the street. And so I used to look at Sidwell with this like awe, like what is this place? And and just to be able to get in there and attend the school was a big deal for me. But I just remember like the level of freedom that I experienced when I arrived there. And I thought about like the ways in which freedom was something that was sort of provided to us as young people, both in the way that we were asked and invited to express ourselves, but also in the ways we were treated and regarded by adults in our lives. And I knew, especially many years later when I became a teacher in New York City and I was teaching in East New York, and I tried to like use some of the things that I learned in Sidwell, and it just didn't work there because the environment wasn't set up for that kind of experience to manifest. So what I mean are such things as just the concept of a free period. I mean, we look at that as something that is not very significant, but what it does is it tells you something really important about what school is meant to be, what education is meant to be. And when, like me, you've had an opportunity to educate young people in public school environments where so much of the experience is organized and oriented around the efficient movement of bodies from one place to the next, and there is absolutely no freedom. And actually the entire structure is designed to keep you in a sort of physical space at all times. That was disorienting to me as an adult to have to think about, well, what did it mean? And why was I someone who was able to have this kind of experience of my education? So that was like one side of it. But then I write about in the book in 8th grade. So in 8th grade was the same year the Central Park Five. We all know the Central Park Five story. And that happened to be the year that we read Othello. And I remember being the only Black boy in my class reading that book or reading that play and just getting smaller and smaller as that play moved on, because there was this thing that we were just not talking about. Right? We were just not having an actual like real conversation about what is actually going on here. It felt like we were trying to obscure the racial dimension of that conversation. And for me, as a 14-year-old sitting in that room, in that classroom, knowing that in the backdrop, and this is why I think backdrop is so important, these 5 young boys who were my age were now being accused of, in their lives were being completely upended because of an accusation of rape relative, raping a white woman in Central Park. I just felt just incredibly alone and isolated, and wanted my teachers, wanted someone to reach out and be able to make some observation of what was happening for me. So it was the silence. I keep going back. It was so many of the gaps. It was reading The Great Gatsby, and that's not talking about that line when F. Scott Fitzgerald talks explicit. He makes that, they're crossing the bridge, and these 2 Black guys are in a limousine, and they have these big eyes, and the way he expresses that racism is so visceral and so quick and so biting, but we don't pause on it and we don't talk about it. So I'm left to reckon with it on my own. So those were just some examples that I think were important for me in terms of sort of shaping my sense of myself and the extent to which people cared about my narrative in that kind of a space. How about you, Gareth?
Yeah, I think one of the important things in Dax's book, one of the things that really resonated with me is this notion of trying not to take offense at things as a white person and instead sitting with them and really thinking about them. And I think that the book really made me do that about my own life and about my Sidwell experience too. And I think in talking about my friends, with my friends, I think Sidwell was always and always has been an incredibly well-intentioned institution, and oftentimes on the leading edge of many things, doing them better than many of its peers. But that doesn't mean that it was always perfect. And I think part of our experience from the time that Dax and I were there was that punishment was not always handed out equally between Black kids and white kids. Black kids got in trouble or more trouble for things that white kids were doing too. There were a lot of kids who were brought into Sidwell, and if you came into Sidwell in middle school or upper school and you hadn't been there in lower school or middle school, the academic rigor was jarring. And I think the desire to have those kids be successful was not always matched by the support system to help all of the kids be successful. And those were the experiences that some of my friends had when they were at Sidwell. And it doesn't mean that Sidwell was bad or it was doing anything wrong. It just means that, like, when we are introspective about where the school was at that time, 25 years ago, there were some troubles for Black kids there that I'm sure, and I'm curious, Sophia, your experience, that maybe in some ways are changed and maybe in some ways are not.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because when I think about, you know, experiences of like visceral moments of like how race defined my experience, I can't help but think about the shooting of Trayvon Martin and how, you know, Dax, we've talked about this, how the Central Park Five was this really like radicalizing moment for you where you were able to kind of like take stock of those around you and how yes, these were always obviously issues that you knew about, that we knew about, but like seeing it not addressed in the classroom and not being able to like have a space and outlet to discuss it. I remember having a very similar experience where like understanding that someone who is regarded as a child could be shot and killed and then not having a discussion about that in a school in Washington, D.C., where there were so many Black boys in classes with me was something that like I distinctly remember as like a moment where race really defined my experience. And then I think a lot also about how there were particular teachers and moments in classes that did provide that space that independently had to go out of their way to do so outside of the curricula, outside of what particular teachers and, you know, administrations might have had. And I know she's on here, so she's definitely might, you know, smile a bit on this one, but Badia Albana was my advisor in middle school. And I so distinctly remember having conversations where she provided herself to be an outlet to so many students in a middle school environment, which again, if you had this conversation at most other like private institutions and public institutions, that would be such a crazy and radical space. But to be able to come into a science classroom of all places and be able to have such deep and open and empathetic conversations, I think that's where, as you were talking about, Gareth, like the well-intentioned spirit is like really manifests itself in individuals, not necessarily like the administration at all times. And again, I think that's our like the positivity and what can come out of the experience really shines through.
You know, I'm just so appreciative of the ways that you all are framing things because, you know, I write and I wrote this book with a particular set of experiences. And even as I wrote them, I had to constantly step back and question, is that true? Does that accurately reflect reality? I want to make sure, and of course, memory is what memory is, but I wanted to make sure that I wasn't sort of missing things. And I also was very cautious and considerate of the fact of the value that that Sidwell experience has had to my life. I mean, not going to sugarcoat that at all. It's had tremendous value to my life in many different respects. And I think that's what love is the ability to hold something up to the light and be able to reckon with it, with the recognition that even as I offer you some critical feedback, that isn't meaning I'm turning away from you. It doesn't mean I'm throwing you away. And I feel like as we look at our conversations right now and our sort of broader education conversations around quote unquote critical race theory, that's what's the most troubling about those kinds of the sort of the desire to shut those conversations down is that there's a lack of recognition of the kids like me who are in the classroom as well, who are not getting information about their story and their contribution and their part of the journey that is just completely one that folks would like to not have in there at all. But I think it's just the B that people can't hold a both and, you know, that people can't hold the tension of a duality. There's this notion of a binary that one has to be the other, either or. And I think that's a construct that is really problematic and gets in the way of us really being able to sort of have these mature kinds of relationships with experiences that don't have to be all good or all bad in order for them to be valuable and beneficial.
Yeah, Dax, I think that's right on. I mean, you and I have talked about this a lot in the last year, after you wrote your letter that, I don't think for all the amazing things about the United States of America, I don't think that this is the most introspective culture in the world. We are a culture that inspires people to create a narrative about themselves and then live that narrative to the fullest degree, right? And I think what we're saying is that this is a moment that actually requires people to be introspective, and we're doing that at the same time that there is a massive movement to crush this conversation by labeling it something that it isn't, essentially creating a boogeyman out of it, and then stepping on it. Mm-hmm. And so you've got this cultural phenomenon that I think pushes back against introspection in general. And then you've got this political movement that is doubling down on that by trying to create this boogeyman. And I think a lot of what's in your book is really just asking people to be part of not letting that happen, right? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's funny, I give Sidwell so much credit because, we're sitting here and said a couple of things that are not flattering about the school, but one of the incredible things about Sidwell is that it always inspired introspection. It literally asked you to sit with thoughts in silence and think about them. And that's something that I respect in them letting us have this dialogue, but it's also something that I think your book is asking more for from people. And it was a big takeaway for me. And Sophia, I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I think in terms of facilitating opportunities for introspection, I think, as you mentioned, I think so much about my experience at Sidwell, and one of the particular moments that always comes to mind is meeting for worship, and how beyond just having space to reflect upon, whatever might be happening about your day, what might be happening within your family, in politics, in the larger world, but also being able to reflect on that exact moment and listen to other people with an empathetic voice. Because what is so particularly crazy and amazing about spaces like Meeting for Worship is that they're not places for debate. They're not places to debate people's experiences and thoughts. One can speak, offer their voice, offer their reflection, and then the room is asked to sit and reflect upon that, not immediately respond or rebut, whatever that may be. So I think that's a really special thing that I take with me in being able to instill introspection into my kind of almost daily routine. But I also think spices, the fact that I can still remember that I've graduated college, spices are in my brain till probably the end of my days. The tenets of Quakerism really ask you to value the people around you and genuinely go into those conversations with them with the best possible mindset, that those you're speaking to don't mean ill or don't wish ill, but there's something beyond that. I think that's something really special that is kind of missing from, contemporary debate. But Dax, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
I mean, you both have sort of I just getting so much and so much value out of listening to both of you break it all down. I mean, I was really intentional about creating a book that felt different, meaning it almost breaks that wall where it's a book talking to itself or to an abstract audience, where it is really trying to make folks understand that I'm looking for you to do work as you read this. You're not able to read this book as a passive experience. I'm not asking you actually to read this book and have any pity for me. Please do not think that that's what I'm asking for when I tell you anything about my experience. I got arrested. Sure, that happened a couple of times, but I'm telling you that because there was learning that came out of that, or because I want to understand how you've experienced certain situations that might have led to that outcome for me. I'm not asking for you to just sit back and say, that's a really bad thing that happened to that Black guy, because I think that's what we've done a lot. It's that we've gotten too accustomed to sort of doing the hand-wringing thing without recognizing that there's implications for us in this as well, that we actually have some, and I always say this, I use this term that, it is unfortunate that this society has taught us to believe that the only people that are racialized are people of color. It does not assume, it does not teach us that people who are white, who are socialized as white as well, and there are in certain instances, certain parts of the world, and it's different in parts of the country, there are certain meanings that come along with that. There's certain associations that can be blended in with that. And unchecked and unreflected upon, one can look around and see one's life, and one's life has completely sort of, does not in many ways reflect who they thought they were. I do think one has to make some reflective choices about everything from where do I want to send my kids to school, to what neighborhood do I want to live in, to, all sorts of things that have political and social political implications. It might be hard to reflect on, right? Because, when I read, for instance, that, a Black woman had to, ostensibly, erase her presence from her home in order to get maximum value for it as an appraisal, that tells me something that's deeply systemic. And I'm asking and hoping that white people who are seeing that as well understand that there's some value you derive from that woman's house being devalued, right? There's an inflated value that you also get out of that deal. It's not just that it's, oh, that's too bad. That there's a flip side to that is there is value that's being attributed to be just being white and having white and whiteness is part of your experience. So my goal is reflection, and partly because I know that talking to my white friends, those who I know intimately and those who I might know less intimately, there's, especially as a man who's, living in this particular moment in time, there's a lot of pressure, but there's also a lot of assumed malintent when people interact with white men around these conversations. I feel like a lot of, and that creates defensiveness. I get that. And that creates a need to feel as to create walls. And what I want to do is not have those walls get in the way of what could really be powerful and beautiful work that can allow us all to move forward collectively together.
I'm Zooming on my phone, listening to
It's all there. I'm curious though. I know this is a bit like, a little bit tangential, but we had a bit of a flow here, but I want to go with it a bit. We've talked a bit about Sidwell explicitly, but I'm almost interested in as well in I'm like moving us to sort of like thinking about the book does kind of deal with some of the practical side of, there's a whole practical element in Gareth. I'm really conscious of the fact that that's kind of the stuff you were sinking into and linking with. And so I'm just sort of curious about how you experienced some of the sort of practical pieces of how you can think about this work in your family, community, in your institution, in your organization, because I think that's what a lot of people are, even in this call, hungering for. Like, yeah, I want to make change, but how do I do that? Or how do I do that in a way that doesn't feel like it's tokenizing people? How do I do that in a way that doesn't feel like it's inauthentic or doesn't result in outcomes that I don't intend? So I'm interested in what you might have found in the book, both of you, what you might have found in the book that might have some practical relevance and resonance for you, and also what you might have seen yourself even apply in the workplace in the past year that has brought some different outcomes.
Yeah, no, I'll jump in. There's a point in the book where you talk about the vice presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Mike Pence, and how Mike Pence essentially tries to sort of debase any conversation around race by just saying, my opponent would have you believe that we're a racist country, and we're not a racist country. And I think that's the fallback out of making change, right? Is to debase the conversation, make it appear as if somebody is making a blanket accusation, which is not actually what's happening, and then just walk hell-bent away from even having the conversation in the first place. And I think that's what's really, the book makes it incumbent on everybody to avoid, because I think even well-intentioned people, and I would not personally put Mike Pence in that list, but even well-intentioned people, I think, can use similar tropes to walk away from actually making change. One of the things that, Dax, my conversation started about, and you get at this in the book, is when you take it out of the 30,000 foot conversation, there's just a bunch of stuff you can go do, especially if you're in a role where you actually have power to make change. And I've been really fortunate to end up in one of those places. And so, both in your book and in your conversations with me, we talked really openly, like about how you write job descriptions and what it is that you demand from employees when they're applying, and how you evaluate employees once they're actually in jobs. And in the book and in 5 minutes of talking to you, you gave me 4 ideas for things that I could literally just go and do that would make the workplace that I live and breathe in a more equitable place for everybody. And so I think when you strip away the politicization of all of this, there's a practicality around it for people who want to make change that you can get to really, really quickly. And I like the way that the book actually sets up the questions you need to ask to get there.
Yeah.
I think that Gareth got at a lot of larger points. And just to point out one tiny thing here, I think a lot of the time in like higher academic spaces, which like we've been fortunate enough to be in, I think there can be a real focus on like devaluing the personal, that your experience is not as important as scholarly articles or the law as an institution, or these larger big things that it's really hard to fight against when you hear the law or the thing or the academics, like those are hard things to go up against. And when you are coming to conversations with your personal experience, that can be something that people again weaponize to push down people of color, particularly Black people's experiences and their value to the conversation. So being able to understand that you've been taught, a system of goals or a system of governance, all these things, but also being able to really value people's experiences within that. It's easier said than done, and there are great practical steps to that in Dax's book, but I think it's an overall like really good thing to move through your life with.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I have the benefit of being able to work both with like corporate entities, nonprofits, foundations, and from a practical side, now even some schools as well. Like, and from a practical side, I think there are some points where people get really stuck, and that stuckness, I identify having to do with there's usually some like deeply held value that has not been fully named. And so therefore, when we get at that or try to get at that thing right there becomes a sort of wall of resistance that's built around it. And ultimately that value is probably one of the things that if we can unlock that or pivot that could really create some real new opportunities. So I think, for instance, it is the case that when people often are thinking about diversity, and we talk about this, we've all talked about, so they think about diversity, they think about the lens of how do we get people in here, right? That's where they kind of like, how do we recruit new people? How do we get people in here? And what I'm almost wanting people to do more before you even think about like, this is the place to bring in, to diverse, it's like, have you done some work to refine and reflect on what is here? And what are the things that we have set up to define what is here? And how important are those sort of things that we've defined as what is here in so far as if people who come in with different experiences don't have those same values, the same whatever it is, are we going to make the necessary adjustments? Are we going to shift our identity? Are we going to create the space for people to not only just be present, because we can do representation all day. I don't think that's the hard thing. But the other piece around it is, we talk about it, whether it's inclusion and creating a sort of a just space for them to be in. But I know for me, so what I see is some of those patterns that create those barriers have to do with sort of, organizational structures and kind of the ways in which the kind of hierarchy has already been designed and how decisions get made and who's involved in those decisions. And shifting that and disrupting that is very difficult for people because that means shifting their relationship to power. And that's, to be really clear, I think part of what we're dealing with right now in the national discourse, and part of what's challenging about even these institutional discourses, is that people's relationship to power is such that it is very difficult for them to do the work necessary to just sort of to figure out how to share it, how to sort of maybe offer some up, because identity is tied to that too. Like lots of it's about like, I get and derive a lot of my personal sense of who I am in relationship to my ability to own this space and be a part, whatever that might be. But I'm curious from your perspectives, when you have seen, whether for you, Sophia, in college and you know, at an elite institution, and I think part of what was happening in Columbia this past year, the call has been like, yo, why don't y'all open up and allow more people to get into Columbia? Like, same thing with Harvard, same thing with these. Why do you need to have this sort of great race to whittle down to these very few people when you have many more people that are qualified? And we've clearly demonstrated that we can educate more people through this, even this virtual environment. So I'm curious about, from your perspective, like what if you were to look at even your institution, your experience at Columbia, where have you seen some things that have been effective and successful as strategies? And if you think about your colleagues, your friends, your own self, your own experience, what might be some of the things that institutions could do to effectively live out their values as it relates to inclusion and equity?
Yeah, so I think about two kind of like base examples of how institutions can sometimes falter with including people from diverse backgrounds. And it's a really, really like minute example, but I think it speaks to a larger thing. So I came to Sidwell in the 3rd grade. I came from a Montessori school, and Montessori education is very like individualistic. You're supposed to choose your own adventures, the best way to describe it. So I came from that kind of learning environment. And when I came to Sidwell, this teacher distinctly would bring this up with me literally till the day I graduated, that I, on my first day, said, yeah, this is not going to work. I don't love math in the afternoon. I learn better in the morning. So like, let's change that up. Let's do that. And I was immediately met with like, what? What are you talking about? Like, absolutely not. This is the way we learn. This is the way you have to learn. And again, that's a very like small example, but I think it speaks to a larger problem that we have people coming from varying, perspectives, educational systems, family structures. And when they're being brought into institutions, the work shouldn't be to mold them into exactly what these institutions want you and expect you to be, because that is the white model of, success. But when you're bringing in all these people from varying economic backgrounds, from varying ethnicities, you also have to understand that varying levels of success and how to communicate those things to them have to shift, that people can have different learning, approaches, all of these different things. And when you're keeping everyone to the same exact educational model, it's really difficult to assume that students that have not necessarily been represented in those institutions are going to succeed at the same capacity immediately. Because some can change and some can falter and some can immediately strive to exactly what the institution is regarded as successful, but that doesn't happen all the time. So that's kind of my like large example. I think at Columbia, a thing that was shown this year was Columbia has lots of its problems. There's a lot of things to work on. But one thing that the school has done for many years it's had graduation ceremonies where they've had different graduation ceremonies for people to be able to have a Black, graduation, to have a Latinx graduation, to have an LGBTQ plus community graduation. And those are in addition to our traditional college and university graduations. That has happened for the last 40 years, I believe. And you might have heard about this from a news cycle from earlier this year on a lot of conservative media, but it was focusing on how Columbia was doing the wrong thing by messing up the story, but saying that we were requiring that people be subjugated by race and sexuality and that you had to do that. These were obviously not mandatory. These were if you wanted to. But I think that's an example actually of like a positive thing that the institution does, where it offers people to be able to celebrate, which is something that we don't really talk a lot about, like celebrating successes. We keep those till graduation, even at the elementary and middle school and high school level. But that's an opportunity where you can be around people of the same background as you and really like have a moment of pure joy. I think that is a really great example of a really small thing that an educational institution can do that puts a lot of pride and joy in your community that you've come to Sidwell or to a larger elite institution with.
Gareth, I'm gonna say if you want to add to this, you get the last.
I mean, I would just say, and I think Sophia, was very well sort of articulated about some of the basic fundamental things that universities can change. But for me, the whole system is just fundamentally flawed, and institutions are kind of scared of their own shadows now, right? Like they know that they are being exposed for what they are, which is not as diverse as they could or should be, not as equitable as they often could or should be. And they are genuinely afraid of their own shadows and reactive in response to that. And we live in a world right now where you're not going to make everybody happy. And so the institutions are reacting to the body politic and dancing left and right, trying to appease everybody. And ultimately, a lot of these schools, I think, haven't decided what they want to be. And in a world where you're going to piss somebody off all the time, it would be a lot better if they decided what free speech meant to them, what being equitable meant, what being diverse meant, and just put a stake in the ground and stood by it, rather than trying to react to what every student, teacher, newspaper says they could or should be. Because right now, what these campuses look like is they're rudderless, and that they don't really have an identity that they believe in. So I think this is a kind of crossroads for the university system as a whole, especially when they're gouging people for $50,000, $60,000 a year to figure out what the hell they're going to be and what they're trying to sell people, because right now it's very unclear.
You know, I've had the benefit of working with a couple of colleges over the past year. These are the schools that are $60,000 a year that you speak about. And what I found is that when I talk to this, into your point, I've definitely seen there's an incredible amount of fear among faculty, and some of it's legitimate in the sense that yeah, you could actually show up on social media the next day. Yeah, actually that can happen, and it can really have a real impact on your life. But what I also find is that when I talk to students is that there's a lot more nuance in their perspective than they're given credit for. There's a lot more space for appreciating that their elders, the folks that are, the power brokers, that there's a lot more space for appreciating that positionality, but what there's little tolerance for is inauthenticity. What there's little tolerance for is the platitudes. What there's little tolerance is for, this sort of continuing promise for a next conversation, or even just more conversations. Like people are conversation out in that sense, and they would like to see some action. So I think what I've said, even try to recommend to talk to folks is, appreciate that the younger folks that you have now turned into and have now come to believe are there to tear everything down. They actually want an education. They just want the education to be a value to them and not just to you, right? They want to actually have a voice and a say in how that education plays out, and they feel entitled to have that, right? So that's part of it. And then there's also a recognition of, similar to the conversation we had earlier, of if you're going to teach me this element of it, I need you to have some level of competence or a willingness to engage in inquiry, to bring in the shadow side of those stories that often have not been allowed to have space to breathe. So even if you might not be an expert in that part of the story, I need you to name that, be honest about it, and let's do that work together. And actually we can learn together. That's challenging for people generationally who've taken and created, whose perceived value is their expertise. And if everything is built around this sense that I have to know all, and therefore my knowingness is the thing, it becomes very difficult to even hear the nuance that people are trying to articulate. So
I think that's right. I think that's right. They also have to be environments, though, where people who want to learn and want to engage in these issues, but maybe have a different starting place and a different knowledge base, are not afraid to make a mistake and engage, because that's the other part of this that becomes deadly. Is you got a bunch of people who kind of sit on the sidelines or join the revolt against equality because they're scared of making a mistake. And there are some mistakes that are honest in the learning process. And I think educational institutions need to give space for that as well.
Before we transition to the question and answer, this is one little thing I wanted to read to you. And it was it's actually just a few lines. And it's not even my words, really. It's actually the words of George Bush in 1991 at the graduating class of the University of Michigan.
Are you about to give us 1,000 points of light?
No, man, it's not about to happen. I'm going to talk about political correctness, like the last time we've been in this space. So this is what he wrote. The notion of political correctness, this is what he said to this graduating class. The notion of political correctness has ignited controversy across the land. And although the movement arises from laudable desire to sweep away the debris of racism and sexism and hatred, it replaces old prejudice with new ones. It declares certain topics off limits, certain expressions off limits, even certain gestures off limits. I read that line and I was like, this is 1991. And it could have been today that was said. We have rehashed this discussion constantly finds a new way to emerge. So for me, that was me in high school. That was happening. I didn't listen to it. That was happening when I was in high school. And to see the reemergence of a similar narrative is very telling to me. Like these are tricks from an old bag. Like this is not new stuff that has been deployed. And how we have to be we have to engage. Juan Jewel, I see you out there, brother. You have to engage with history. You have to engage with history because these things continue to repeat themselves. And then we find ourselves caught inside the emotionality of a moment without recognizing that has often been deployed for the very purpose of eliciting an emotional reaction and response without a recognition of the political intentions behind that, which are often to get people who might be on the fence or who might not be really aware or who might just want to get through their lives to galvanize them on the side of a pushback against any kind of shift or change or equity. So I just want to bring that in because I do a lot of bits of history in the book to help people think about and situate the sort of flows and patterns that we've lived through in the last 60 to 70 years, to recognize that these things happen again and again, that we were bound to see the pushback after last summer. The pendulum was bound to swing back in this way because the same thing happened after the riots in 67 and 68 in that summer. We saw the election we saw the silent majority step up and we saw Richard Nixon. It is what happens in this country. And so we can, if we get historical, we can at least step outside of it, observe it, and begin to deconstruct where we want to sit inside of that. And with that, I'm gonna pause because I know Anna she's been chomping on the bit to get some questions into this space before we have to close. So I'm gonna pause, invite Anna in to ask if there's some questions maybe that people have brought from the audience.
Well, thank you guys so much. You actually just answered a little bit one of the first questions that I was going to offer that came in even before tonight through our registration form. I'm going to re-ask it and maybe ask you all to sit with it and take it one step further. But this came from an alum who wrote, I'm just going to read her words so that you all can hear them. As a non-Black minority who has faced all varieties of discrimination, I am sure that I have also said inappropriate things out of unawareness and the fact that we did not grow up having meaningful discussions about race in America. How can I have conversations that will open the door to more understanding without putting the burden on the other person to be an educator, a role I often do not have the energy to take on? I feel like you spoke a lot to that parts of that just a second ago, but I wanted to re-offer it to see if there's additional conversation there.
Yeah, I mean, not to have this conversation just be, pro history and studying history. I did just graduate with a history degree. But with that said, I do see Darren Spees here, and he is an incredible history teacher at Sidwell, who I think would also be able to give me a thumbs up on this one, that I'm making him proud and the Sidwell History Department proud. But I do think that, I'm a non-Black minority. I think that's a really important thing. And I'm also the daughter of a white mom. And I think that's something that I think a lot about when I go into spaces. And it's one of the reasons that I decided to not only major in Middle Eastern history, but also, American Southern history, and being able to, one, understand the state, Virginia, that I grew up in, but also like the larger Southern institution that has created so many of, the racist institutions that we continue to put up. And I think what that really means, and it's a really, really hard thing to grapple with, but you hear this a lot that your friends of color and your Black friends are not your educators, which one, true, don't turn to them. But two, that does mean that it does take a bit of yourself to be committed to fundamentally understanding not only what their experiences are, but what has led to those experiences occurring and being able to propagate those. So it is of, these continuous shootings that continue to happen across the country. They're not new things. They're not new and like you can't explain why these things continue to happen, that our police structure happens the same way, that DC politics continue to end up the same way that they are. It's because history tells us that they will occur, that they have occurred, and that they will occur again. So it does take a bit of onus on yourself to be able to go and educate yourself. And I think honestly, Gareth is a really good example of someone who has taken the time to commit themselves to understanding what not only his Black friends might be experiencing, but also what continues to dictate their own behavior and why they have acted. I think, as the question said, like they've said inappropriate things out of unawareness. And it's not about beating yourself up on what you did wrong in that moment, but understanding what you can do going forward. I hope that helps and answers that question.
That was mic drop, mic drop. I think like, only thing I would probably add to that is that it is important to understand that this thing called anti-Black racism is a really particular thing that exists in our culture. And it does have deep roots. And in many ways, it is designed to even have people, non-Black people of color, to more closely align themselves with being white in America than anything. And that's part of the initiation rite sometimes to being an American, is to not be Black, is to be as far possible away from being Black as you can, meaning live away from them, don't associate, don't have your children date them. Like it is important to recognize that there has been a very large project, and that project it's deeply invested in, and it extends very far. And that when you arrive in this country, or if you grow up as a non-Black person of color, that you will experience discrimination as well. And you will probably also experience points in which you maybe in relation to Black people might be the model minority. That will happen as well. What I would only add is that for me as a Black person, I make a commitment to try to show up for people, because I feel like a lot of folks have shown up for me. A lot of my friends of color have shown up for me. And so I hear that question about burden. Me personally, I've taken that job on, in the sense that like, this is work I do in the world. I actually am okay with people. If you come at me with the right, like the level of inquiry and the desire to learn, I'm not gonna go with I'm tired. That's just my choice. It's not somebody else's, but I feel like I've had certain life experiences, educational experiences that have created a set of responsibilities that I have. And I'm very fortunate, and I'm open to being in conversation with people who desire to learn, even if they're still stumbling along the way. I use this idea in the beginning of all my sessions with people. I always say, I talk about this idea of speaking in first draft, and Anna, you see me, you've seen, it's like this idea of speaking in first draft. I learned from a friend of mine recently, and I try to tell everybody, it's like, we've got to give ourselves this space to say things and to make mistakes, while not letting people off the hook for the impact of the statements that they've made, right? There's a duality there, but we have to allow people to do that work, because otherwise, how do folks learn? So that's what I would offer. But again, I think Sophia dropped the mic. Great points.
I know we're at a minute after 9 here, but I do want to ask one more question. We got a lot of great questions that came in, and I think we could spend another hour here just asking them. But I do want to ask one question that I think is really thoughtful and is very simple, and is just, what is the best advice, as we think about the whole conversation we've had tonight? What's the best advice each of you has ever received?
I assume pertaining to the topic at hand, because I've gotten advice about gambling in Vegas, about, so I assume we're talking about this in particular. Though.
Yeah. That's grounded.
That's a safe assumption, yes.
Yeah. I think the best advice I'll start. The best advice that I got is to really try, as a white person, to just try to stop being so damn offended all the time, and to step outside of yourself for a second and realize that, like, the things that have gone on in the world, that by pointing them out, it doesn't make it your fault. It doesn't mean that you have to recede from the conversation. It doesn't mean that you have to run away and hide because somebody told you that you're bad. It is literally just a statement of fact. And if you are incapable of living in that fact, you're kind of a child. And so if you are a grown up, sit with the facts a little bit, learn them and absorb them, and realize it's not personal. It's not about you. And I think one of the things I think is right about like white America in general is there's this notion that everything's about you. And so even the issues of race get played back and they become something that's about you in some way, shape, or form. And I think the ability to just step outside of yourself for a little bit and just be a human being and realize it's not about you, and to live in the thoughtful space in the way that Quakerism encourages you to do, I think has been really, really valuable for me.
I think one of the best pieces of advice I've received is to like treat your life as though you are a student who will never actually answer the question correctly, that there is no perfect answer, there's no great fill in, box. But I think with that in mind, it also allows you to give yourself some grace and some space to be wrong, that we are not always right every time we approach conversations on the topic of race and where America stands today, that what we might have answered a day ago, we can learn better. We can always learn better and reach some better conclusion for that day. It's not the best answer in general, but it's your best answer for that day. And I think that goes like particularly for, non-Black minorities in the country. Like there's a lot of, as Gareth said, like there is just this like kind of way of people trying to make it about themselves, like regardless of where you are and what your identity might be. So trying to take the space to be empathetic and try and understand where other people might be coming from.
Turn it off.
Spice
Yeah. They're good, aren't they?
These kinds of questions are so hard. So I'm actually going to just maybe pull something from my book, that maybe some advice I might be giving to other people, and I'm going to just pretend that it was advice given to me. I would say this idea I write about, just sort of like, buckle up. We're going to be on this journey for a while. Do not think that, and it's okay to be on this journey for a while. Like, there's actually joy in this as well. Like, do not approach all elements and aspects of diversity work or work around as if it's a labor, and as if it's a labor that is just fraught with joylessness and pain, because actually the people at the center of this work are celebratory people too. The people who find or are able to create space for joy. And actually what they're trying to open up, what we are trying to open up, is actually that there is real joy when we start to treat each other in a different way. That when we let go of some of this notion of hierarchies that are rooted in these sort of notions of value and worth and merit, we actually begin to unlock something that is way more beautiful, way more exciting, way more sustainable, because the amount of effort, energy is required to remain at odds with everyone, to remain at odds with the world as it's moving in the direction it's moving. It just feels like lots of wasted energy that could be directed towards joy. And so I work with people who are joyful people who are poets, who are creatives, who are artists. And I just want to say that was maybe not, I don't know if it's been advice that has been given to me that I try to live out in my work, is that do not approach these conversations just that they all are heavy and that they're dark. Gareth, over the last year or so, we've laughed a lot too. We find like friendship isn't just, can we talk about the heavy thing all the time? So it is just the light thing too. And it is the ability to be able to see that when we can get past some of this stuff, it creates levity. And that levity is just like, it's different air to breathe. So I would offer that, as advice that I might have given to myself. It might be right. It might have written in the book somewhere. So, maybe you want to pick up the book.
Well, on that note, I know we could stay here all night and continue the conversation, but I want to say a huge thank you to our three wonderful guests this evening, for being here, for the time that you've spent talking to us, talking to each other. These events don't happen in a vacuum. It takes a little bit of getting it together, and these guys worked really hard to find the right way to hit some really thoughtful points about a conversation that could go on obviously for hours and hours. The book is called Letters to My White Male Friends. This is my little Dax should hold up his copy because his is the really nice one that just came out.
Oh, it's beautiful. I'm telling you, you like it.
We obviously encourage you to get it, but I also want to say a huge thank you to everyone who is here tonight. You all spending the time to be in community with each other, with our guests here, sharing questions, being part of conversations like these. It's truly wonderful. It's important, and we greatly appreciate you spending your time with other Sidwell Friends community members. So thank you for being here. We have several more conversations with friends events scheduled this summer. So check it out on the Sidwell website and on the alumni calendar. And we wish you all a very, very wonderful evening. Thanks again for being with us.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Gareth. Thanks, Sophia. Thank you so much, y'all. Appreciate you.